The Lumix S5 II and S5IIx have now an additional E-stabilization mode called High. We're going to compare how those stabilization modes are affecting the image quality of the S5 II and S5IIx. We will also compare E-stabilization with the DJI RS3 gimbal. For this, we will use different lenses and compare how they perform with different stabilization modes and with the gimbal. To get the most sharpness of the image to compare E-stabilization with no stabilization, we're going to use f4. E-stabilization is cropping the picture on the sensor in order to move the image around on the sensor so it stabilizes with your movement. With the high mode, this is even cropped more and more intense. This means when filming in OpenGate 6K, you have less pixels available on your sensor to capture your image. This is how it looks like without E-stabilization. This is now with E-stabilization set to standard. You can see the vignetting of my ND filter disappeared. This is now with E-stabilization set to high, and you can see the image is even more cropped. Here we have the full sensor area of the S5 II or S5IIx, which consists of 6000 by 4000 pixels. In E-stabilization mode, we are only using 91% of the sensor's area. This allows the frame to move around on the camera sensor, and in addition to the movement of the sensor, we have the movement through IBIS of the sensor itself. Keep in mind that the 5400 by 3300 pixels are converted to 6K resolution. This upscaling will not add any information at all to our image. With E-stabilization high, we are only using around 70% of the sensor's area. This is very close to Cinema 4K in APS-C mode. We have here only 4100 by 2700 pixels. This resolution is then upscaled to 6K. But this will not add any benefit at all, since there's no added information. 6K E-stabilization high will look the same as when shooting without E-stabilization in Cinema 4K APS-C mode. In addition, having 6K with E-stabilization high, but having effectively only the pixel information of Cinema 4K will worsen your video quality. In 6K we have 150 Mbit, and in Cinema 4K we also have 150 Mbit. But for 6K we have to compress a lot more data with 150 Mbit as we have to do with Cinema 4K. This means we have for 6K only 6.66 bits per pixel, while we have for Cinema 4K in APS-C mode 17.78 bits per pixel. These 17.78 bits per pixel are also applied to Cinema 4K in full frame. In conclusion, if you're using E-stabilization high in full frame mode, use Cinema 4K instead of 6K. By using E-stabilization high in full frame with Cinema 4K with 400 Mbit all intra, you might even achieve more quality. Now enough of the analysis, let's jump to the framing comparison. And later you will see how E-stabilization performs handheld versus on a gimbal. Now we're comparing 18mm with the other focal lengths. 24mm with E-stabilization is the same like 18mm with E-stabilization high. At 50mm the field of view is already smaller than at 18mm with E-stabilization high and APS-C crop. At 85mm the field of view is only a small part compared to 18mm. I hope this helps you with the field of view of different focal lengths. At ISO 640 you don't see much difference between no E-stabilization and E-stabilization. In E-stabilization high you can see in the dark areas some noise. When we apply denoising there is not much difference in the first two, but in E-stabilization high you will see a little bit more noise in the dark areas. With increased contrast and saturation you can see in E-stabilization high a little bit more noise than in the first two. If we apply now denoising, you can see that at E-stabilization high, the movement of the noise is still there in the dark areas. At ISO 4000 we can see a lot more noise. It's difficult to make out if there's more noise in E-Stabilization High. However, if we apply now denoising, you can see maybe a little bit more of waviness movement in the E-Stabilization High image. So now with increased contrast and saturation, you don't see much difference in the first two, but when you look at the third example of E-Stabilization High, there's a lot more movement in the noise. With E-Stabilization High, the image might be a little bit more mushy, but it's difficult to determine. .6K E-Stabilization High in full frame looks very much identical to APS-C Cinema 4K. With noise reduction applied, we won't see much difference, but we probably will see more difference when we have scenes with movement due to the bitrate. So here we have our test area that we're gonna walk along. We have a little step to introduce some shake, and we're gonna use the different stabilization modes and the gimbal, which will help you then to answer the question, is the gimbal even necessary, or can you just go out and shoot handheld with everything? 18mm with IBIS and without E-Stabilization. 18mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization standard. 18mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization set to high. 18mm with gimbal without E-Stabilization and without IBIS. 18mm with gimbal with IBIS without E-Stabilization. 18mm with gimbal with IBIS and with E-Stabilization standard. 18mm with gimbal with IBIS and E-Stabilization high. Let's use now the DaVinci Resolve built-in translation stabilization to see what we can do to improve the image. $18mm with IBIS and without E-Stabilization. 18mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization standard. 18mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization set to high. $24mm without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. 24mm with IBIS, no E-Stabilization. Handheld, of course. 24mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization standard, I think. 24mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization mode high. Handheld. 24mm with gimbal, no IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 24mm with IBIS, with gimbal, no E-Stabilization. 24mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization standard, I think, on a gimbal. 24mm on a gimbal with IBIS and E-Stabilization high. 24mm without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. 24mm with IBIS, no E-Stabilization. Handheld, of course. 24mm with IBIS and with E-Stabilization standard, I think. 24mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization mode high. Handheld. 50mm handheld, no IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 50mm IBIS, no E-Stabilization and handheld. 50mm IBIS, E-Stabilization Standard and handheld. 50mm IBIS, E-Stabilization High and handheld. 50mm on a gimbal, no E-Stabilization, no IBIS. 50mm on a gimbal with IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 50mm on a gimbal with IBIS, no E-Stabilization, but with super smooth stabilization of the DJI RS3. 50mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization on a gimbal. 50mm on a gimbal with E-Stabilization High and IBIS, of course. $50mm handheld, no IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 50mm IBIS, no E-Stabilization and handheld. 50mm IBIS, E-Stabilization Standard and handheld. 50mm IBIS, E-Stabilization High and handheld. $85mm handheld, no IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 85mm handheld with IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 85mm handheld with IBIS and E-Stabilization Standard. 85mm handheld with IBIS and E-Stabilization High. 85mm on a gimbal without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. 85mm on a gimbal with IBIS, no E-Stabilization. 85mm on a gimbal with IBIS and super smooth. 85mm on a gimbal with IBIS and E-Stabilization Standard. 85mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization High on a gimbal. So now you saw how the E-Stabilization performs versus a gimbal. With E-Stabilization you sometimes have those micro jitters that cannot be removed, even not in post with DaVinci Resolve. When using a gimbal you have more steady footage and you can see that the image is not shaking at all. Now we're gonna see how the gimbal and E-Stabilization perform when you're doing vlogging. This is 18mm handheld without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. This is 18mm with IBIS handheld. This is 18mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization activated. This is 18mm handheld with E-Stabilization High and IBIS. So this here is now 18mm without IBIS and without E-Stabilization on the gimbal. This is 18mm on the gimbal with IBIS without E-Stabilization. This is 18mm on the gimbal with E-Stabilization and IBIS. This is 18mm on the gimbal with IBIS and E-Stabilization mode high. This is 24mm without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. This is 24mm with IBIS but without E-Stabilization, also handheld, like before. This is 24mm handheld with IBIS and E-Stabilization standard. This is 24mm with IBIS and E-Stabilization set to high. 24mm on a gimbal without IBIS and without E-Stabilization. $24mm on a gimbal with IBIS without E-Stabilization. $24mm on a gimbal with IBIS and with E-Stabilization. 24mm on a gimbal with IBIS and E-Stabilization high. So as you have seen, with a gimbal you can achieve pretty good results when you do vlogging, but it's also possible when you use E-Stabilization. And I think you have to decide for yourself if you use the high mode or the normal mode. I think it depends on how rough the terrain is. If you have like a free pathway, you can do your vlogging, or if you are like in a city where there are a lot of people and you have to change direction all the time. Otherwise, E-Stabilization is not perfect, but it definitely gives you some benefit. Keep in mind the tips with going down to Cinema 4K instead of 6K if you use full frame and E-Stabilization. I wish you good luck filming and see you in the next awesome video.